Well, this was a very difficult passage to study, I felt, and many times my head was swimming. And I'll tell you why. Because there are multiple levels of instruction that are happening in a passage like this. And there's other parts of Matthew and other Gospels that the same is happening. But first level, like Jesus is specifically instructing 12 disciples. We're at the end of Matthew 9, beginning of chapter 10. He's specifically instructing 12 disciples around 30 AD or sometime around there. But the second level then is Matthew is coming along a couple decades later, writing to the listeners or speaking to the listeners of his day, maybe 50 or 60 AD, but he's using Jesus' teaching that was to these 12 apostles, but there's a little bit different, like a little different nuance maybe of what Matthew's wanting to communicate, what he's choosing to communicate, and he picks specific events and teachings from Jesus' life to highlight certain theological truths that he wants to communicate to his listeners 20 or 30 years after Jesus was instructing his disciples. So that's another level. A third level is now, like, I've studied the passage and I'm now instructing you all based on what Matthew was writing to his listeners, based on what Jesus was writing to his, or saying to his listeners. And you guys know my instruction is not divinely inspired like Matthew and Jesus, but our context is a little different than those previous two contexts, and so there's a little bit of a nuance to what we read that we want to understand for us. And so you can see, like, there's several things to think about when you're studying a passage like this, and I hesitate to even tell you, like, even another, like, Jesus says, he mentions a couple things when he's talking to people, and he's bringing up things that prophets spoke, or that people spoke hundreds of years before that, in a different context. Hey, Calvin.
Evangeline, stop.
Calvin, no. No. He's speaking. Jesus brings up stuff to his audience that was spoken hundreds of years earlier to a different context, and he's kind of using that in his teaching. So there's like so many different levels, not to mention like Jesus in this passage a little bit, and certainly passages in the future, like is talking about events that are going to occur and make even more sense in the future sometime in a completely different context. And so there's so much going on, and to try to like determine, like, we're not just watching a video recording of Jesus speaking to his 12 disciples, but there's other things to consider. What was Matthew wanting to communicate, and how was Jesus using the Old Testament? And so I put quite a bit of study into this, and my goal tonight is just to touch on some of that context-specific instruction of Jesus to the 12 and what Matthew wanted to communicate to his community around him, and get a good sense of what's happening there, the author's intent, and then to pull some of the what I call transparent principles to provide application for us in our context. So there's a whole heck of a lot of stuff that can be said about stuff that I won't get into this week or next week. I've actually split chapter 10 into 2 weeks because it was just too much. But I'm not going to talk in detail about authority, like what's going on with the authority that Jesus has and is giving. I'm not going to talk in a ton of detail about what's going on with Jew and Gentile. We'll touch on each of these, but a ton on progressive revelation, Jesus' purpose on earth, all these different things which are involved in there, but I kind of want to highlight some maybe bigger things that Matthew is going at and save some of those little, those other topics for maybe we can talk afterwards about them, or we can look at some books or take some classes or something. But anyway, so I hope to share tonight a little bit about what God might be saying to us, or what we can draw out of it. So, up until this point, Jesus has been saying some things that are morally or ethically difficult to follow. But now Matthew talks about, or starts to talk about, how Jesus was actually not just talking about how the disciples ought to be, but what they actually should do, or what Jesus is telling them to be involved with. So up until this point in the book of Matthew anyway, the disciples of Jesus have been kind of spectators. Jesus has said, follow me. And he's said some radical things, he's done some radical things. But then in verse 37 of chapter 9, it says, then he said to his disciples, and the focus now shifts to some radical works and words that he's calling some of these disciples to, the 12. So in verse 35 of chapter 9, it says this, and Jesus went throughout all the cities, we read this last week, and villages, teaching in their synagogues, and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them. Important, keep that in your mind. Because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest and send out laborers into the harvest. What motivates Jesus, at least that's expressly said here, what motivates Jesus' desire to send workers out into the harvest? Compassion. Yeah, that's one thing at least. Compassion from verse 36. He's seeing these crowds, helpless sheep without a shepherd. He tells the disciples to pray that the Lord would send out laborers into the harvest. Now, the word send out here doesn't necessarily mean like send away, like send to a foreign country, like we send missionaries away. But in this word, it means just to thrust out of like a comfortable context. So he uses the same word when he raises the girl from the dead a couple paragraphs earlier, and he sends the people out of the house. And there's a few that get to see the miracle, but it's just like, it's not necessarily that he's sending them out and away somewhere far. It's just sending them away from the context that they're in. So not necessarily geographically. How many laborers, when Jesus says this, hey, pray for laborers, how many laborers were there at that time that he says that? At least in Matthew's account here. Yeah, few, maybe at least one, Jesus himself, I'd say, is laboring. Maybe John the Baptist, he seemed to be a laborer, but it's very few. So Jesus says, pray earnestly to the Lord of harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And then Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, and he called to him his 12 disciples. And they're like, oh shoot. Like, so you can maybe imagine, like, I don't know that they did this, but like Jesus says, hey, pray to the Lord earnestly. And they start praying, hey, Lord, please send out workers into the harvest. Amen. And then they look up and Jesus says, okay, you 12. And they're like, oh, wait a second. Well, we're just praying for ourselves, I guess. But I don't know if you guys have ever done that. Like, I'll be praying, God, would you send people to share the gospel with my neighbor or whatever. And it turns out I'm praying for myself. Like, he actually wants to send me to speak to them about the gospel. But so he calls to him his 12 disciples, and he gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. I think that Matthew purposely mentions them in kind of these categories. It's Peter and Andrew, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, in these twos, because in another gospel, I think it's Mark, talks about how they were sent out 2 by 2. They're sent out as twos. So these 12 Jesus sent out. Now in verse 5, that sent out is a different word. It's a word that we get apostle from, apostello or something like that. So there's something unique to this sending of the 12. That's a little bit different than what Jesus was telling everybody to pray for. It's both a sending out of some sort, but this is a unique sending. A unique word is used here. So he sends them out, instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And if you remember, Jesus had already kind of looked around and noticed, hey, these people, they're like sheep without a shepherd. So motivated out of compassion for them, he sends the 12 apostles to go to the lost sheep, specifically to the house of Israel, to the Jews. Now, why start with the Jews? I read one commentator that said, hey, maybe there's something kind of practical to it, like they weren't equipped yet to reach the Samaritans or the Gentiles, like they needed to start with somebody who had at least an understanding of some of the message. But I think it's something much more significant than that, something theological that Jesus is getting at, that Matthew's pointing out here. And so Jesus he's like at the crux of history, right? Where there's many things that are changing in God's plan of redemption, this kind of unfolding plan with Jesus. And so instead of making the change like some Gentile thing, like, oh, now this is a new, he starts with the Jews, kind of showing that, yes, he's coming as the promised Messiah to the Jews. Like, that's who he's coming to first. This unfolding plan of God, it begins with Israel, and then later it's expanded more to the Gentiles. You can read all about that in Romans 11. It talks about kind of what's going on with that. But it's a turning point. But in that turning point, before this widespread message goes to the rest of the nations, Jesus wants it to go to the towns of the Jews. And we can see that as it continues on in the book of Acts, even after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, the apostles, they're going around first to the Jewish people. And so there's this specific call to these 12 here in Matthew 10, a call for them to go and start with the Jews. Now, after Jesus' resurrection, he says what's a little more familiar to us, go and make disciples of all nations. And in Acts 1:8, he says, hey, you'll be my witnesses to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, right? That eventually expands out, but it starts with the Jews. And here's what they're supposed to proclaim to them as they go. Verse 7, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That's the exact same thing that John the Baptist was proclaiming, that Jesus was proclaiming. Verse 8, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. These ministries of word and deed. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Here's some miracles. Then he says, you received without paying, give without pay. So acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. And this is just all instruction that he's given these 12. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. So a couple of little things going on there. Jesus tells these apostles, take nothing with you. I think in essence, you will be provided for. Maybe he didn't want people thinking that they were doing all of these miracles to receive pay and to get rich off of it. I don't know that possibility. But whatever they need to accomplish the mission that God's given them to accomplish, God is going to provide for them in people who receive their greeting with peace. These people who are worthy and receive the apostles, worthy, I think, it just has this idea of people are willing to accept you and your message. They're willing to accept you into their home. And we read in Luke, he even gave them like specific things, specific instruction. Here's what you say when they answer the door, peace be to this house. And basically how they respond to that lets you know if you're going to stay there or not. So far, it's like, hey, this mission sounds pretty great for the disciples. We've got some power now to do miraculous things. God's going to provide for us. People are going to let us into their house and feed us and let us stay with them. Like, all cool. Verse 14, and if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly, I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, which had pretty strong judgment. It'll be stronger. it would be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. So kind of what Jesus is talking about here is a pious Jew of the day, when he or she was leaving a Gentile town, would wipe the dust off their shoes and off their clothes, and it was kind of a, hey, I don't want to be associated with the practices of pagan Gentiles or the judgment that they should receive. It's like I want to disassociate with them, so I'm going to just wipe myself clean of that. But interestingly, Jesus, who was he having the apostles go to? It was Jews, Jewish towns. It wasn't Gentile. Like the Jews were used to doing that when they lived in Gentile town, but Jesus is saying, hey, if you're not received, then when you leave that town, knock the dust off your shoes. And so we see this kind of hardening of some of the Jews to the Messiah. And there's actually Jews that aren't receiving Jesus as the Messiah. But we're still good. The disciples may be thinking, okay, people might reject us, but we just get to get up and leave. So it's cool. There's nothing too heavy yet. And then it goes on. And in verse 16, 17, I think it's kind of a shift. Matthew he's not so concerned about having this completely orderly account of here's what Jesus did exactly, and then that followed 3 hours later with this, and it's not quite as orderly as Luke. So sometimes he is consolidating, and everything that he says is true. Jesus actually said these things, but he might be pulling things. It's not necessarily from the same exact teaching. Maybe it happened a few days later, but it was to these disciples. But there's this shift, it seems. It kind of moves away from this specific, hey, here's what these 12 apostles are going to do with these towns of the Jews. And it seems to expand more to what seems like happens more after Jesus has resurrected, after he's ascended. Some of the persecution that he's about to explain is a little bit more like the apostles experienced later, and we don't read anything about this sort of persecution, at least it seems like on this initial mission that he sends them on. But so it's kind of shift, I think, of maybe Matthew telling the audience that he's writing to a few years later, he's wanting to kind of include in, hey, Jesus also tells his disciples these things about going out. And so he says this in verse 16. He says, and still Jesus talking, still to his disciples, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So it's getting a little heavier. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. So you'll receive persecution from the Jewish leaders in the synagogues. You receive some sort of persecution from Gentile leaders, again, which leads me to believe this is maybe talking about even some later kind of mission in front of the governors and kings. Verse 19, when they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you're to say. For what you are to say, I love this, will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Mm-hmm. Now this is like heavy stuff that Jesus is telling his disciples, that this message that they proclaim, this message of the kingdom that they're delivering, is going to lead to beatings and trials. And it's like, okay, this isn't just, oh cool, I can do some miracles and people are going to feed me when I come to their homes, but there's something even more significant as far as persecution comes. Not only that, but verse 21, brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all, or by all kinds of people, for my name's sake, Jesus says. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. So maybe that's upon their death, or maybe that's to the end, like some eschatological future end will be saved. So, wait a second, Jesus. Like hate, death, at the hand of family members, maybe? So I just want to stop and recognize what Jesus is telling these disciples is heavy and significant And it's not just, oh, you get to kind of tag along with Jesus and watch him get in all the trouble, but there's like significant persecution on its way to these guys, and I'd say other disciples as well. And then verse 23, I spent so long studying this passage, and I'm not going to talk about it for very long, but when they persecute you in one town, maybe he's kind of coming back to the initial thing, I'm not sure. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now there's different ways that different scholars and good men and women have taken that. I'll tell you a few of them. There's some that just think that's Jesus' specific instruction to these 12 men, and it's something like one of the other Gospels says Jesus is kind of sending them to places that Jesus is actually going to follow up and go himself, like he's telling them, hey, just go ahead and I'm going to catch up with you kind of thing, and you're not going to get through all the cities before I catch up with you. There's kind of that's a possibility. Other people say what the Son of Man coming here before all the towns of Israel are reached is the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Like there's that's kind of a sign of Jesus coming of judgment on the people of Israel of some sort. Another thing, probably most popular and most commonly, I think, from what I read anyway, of what people think this refers to, is something about the second coming of Christ, a future reality. And in that case, I'm not sure exactly what it means that you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes, but it may be looking forward to that. Matthew actually uses a different word in Matthew 24 to talk about the Son of Man coming. He uses parousia. And so maybe it's the same idea or related, or maybe not. But another view that I thought was interesting and pretty convincing, and again, I won't and I can't get into all of the details of this because I'm not learned enough. But it's just that the meaning of you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. The Son of Man coming could refer to a period of time where Jesus' authority and his power is being demonstrated, specifically around the time of the resurrection and the ascension. And so the Son of Man, that word comes can also mean go, unfortunately, in Greek. And so like maybe it's the Son of Man coming to the Father when he's recognized as the one who has authority over death, and it's a coming to the Father. And so maybe that's a possibility. If that's the case, hey, it kind of would make sense that he's telling these 12, hey, you're not going to reach you won't have gone through all the towns of Israel before that event occurs. Well, yeah, maybe they didn't, and they actually have some more to reach in the book of Acts, and so maybe that works. But what I would like to just kind of say in summary of that is this coming of the Son of Man, or when the Son of Man comes, I think holds and anytime you see that word, even Son of Man, there's a really like rich meaning to that is somewhat context specific, and the meaning of it is just as full as like the coming of the kingdom, like that language. It's like, we kind of struggle to think through, well, what exactly is the kingdom, and when does it come, and when was it started, and when is it now, is it later, is it both, there's so much. It's such a broad topic. I think when the Son of Man comes is kind of similar. And I will say this, that Israel, it seems apparent here, has a unique historical role, and a unique, I think elsewhere in Matthew we also see has a unique future role, like the people of Israel. And I think that shouldn't be a surprise. Like since 1948, like we see stuff going on with Israel, and there's always turmoil in the Middle East, and there obviously is something, or it seems obvious even from just a human perspective. Man, something is going on with Israel. There's something of God's hand or protection or something with Israel, at least that we can see. And I think certainly as you look to Scripture, you see some clear passages where God does something. I don't think Matthew addresses it here per se, but God does something with Israel in the future. So there's some unique historical significance, there's unique future significance, and we'll talk about some of that as that comes up later. But the gospel of Jesus Christ here is going first to the Jews, who many of their hearts are hard and they don't receive it, and so the apostles are going to go on to different towns, and then later it progresses to the Gentiles. Now, the rest of chapter 10, I think, becomes a little bit easier to understand and seems a little bit more transparent for like how ways that we actually ought to live, because we're not going to, as we're preaching and displaying the gospel to people, we don't start with the Jews, and we're not necessarily going like house to house and looking for people to stay with. Like, we don't have like the exact specific things that Jesus is calling the apostles to. He's not necessarily calling us to. And as it seems like in verses of chapter 10, like 5 through 16 or so is kind of real specific to the mission of the apostles. 17 through 23 or so seems like maybe some of the later mission of some of those same apostles and other disciples. And then verse 24 on seems to be no reason why that doesn't apply just equally to any disciple of Jesus, anybody carrying out his mission. But there's things that we can learn. Obviously, it's included in the Bible that we can learn from these earlier verses, and that's what I want to kind of spend the rest of our time talking about. Like, where does this land with us? I don't think this is like Jesus sending out the 12. I don't think it's a formula for how, it's not meant to be an evangelism formula, like here's how you're supposed to do evangelism exactly. Though I think there's things that we can learn about it, which there's some principles about the mission of Jesus that I'd like to point out. First thing is that there is a mission, or we have a mission even. There's this message that went to Israel first, but it expands to the Gentiles, which is the time period that we're living in. And Matthew is telling, like, just like Matthew is using Jesus' mission for those 12 people, Matthew's using that to teach the people of his decades some truths about God's mission and other things. Just like that, it can be just as relevant to us, because we're also looking back at these specific things he's called people to and drawing principles out of that. So it's relevant to us too. And we'll see more at the end of the book, even what I would say is even closer understanding of what our mission is, like moving forward. But we see even from here that there's something that Jesus is calling his disciples to. His disciples aren't just living life and trying to be good people and whatever, but he calls them to go out and to do something. And there's this continuing mission that we'll see through the book of Matthew and through the book of Acts and into the epistles. There's this ongoing mission of God that I think clearly lands like all the way to us in this century, as the task of evangelism is not done in the world. And so our mission isn't just to Jews, but it's to, I would say, anybody who will listen, any Jew or Gentile who will listen to us. And I say it sounds too simple just to say, hey, the first point that Matthew wants to show is that we have a mission. But I forgot, like in my own life, I would say for years, even like years in full-time ministry, like as a pastor at a church, I think I almost like forgot about God's mission to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom. And like I considered, I think like a lot of people, evangelism or outreach is a little segment, it's a ministry of the church that people don't like to sign up for those events, and it's a little part of it. But I miss, man, this is one of the main things that he's calling the 12 to, that he tells his disciples as he's leaving the earth to. I mean, this is not a small thing, but I missed it in my life, I would say, for years, maybe 15 years. Not entirely, but quite a bit. So I just ask you to consider, hey, are you aware that there is a mission advancing and unfolding that God calls you to be a part of? Secondly, the mission, like I mentioned a couple times, even last week, the mission is motivated by Jesus' compassion. So he sends people because of his compassion. That's why he sends the apostles. So verse 36 again of chapter 9. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless. Next verse. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Pray earnestly. So he sees the people, has compassion. He says, hey, pray to the Lord to send out people into the harvest. This mission is motivated by the love of Jesus. Now, Jesus has some really harsh things to say, and we'll see next week too, persecution and hate, and I've come to bring a sword. But the reason that the mission exists in the first place is because of the compassion of Jesus, at least in part. And so contrary to what I think a lot of non-Christians think, like non-Christians watch the news and think that Christians are haters for some reason, when we're telling people about the gospel of the kingdom, it's not because we hate them, but it's motivated out of the love of Christ. It's the motivation behind it. And I don't know about you all, but like sometimes when I'm thinking about being on mission and proclaiming the gospel, I tend to avoid it because I feel like it's a battle against non-believers, like it's me versus them or us versus them. And I'll think, well, I don't want to evangelize because it feels tense. It feels like we're against each other. But I don't think that's how it's supposed to feel. And Jesus is clear that many of them will be against us, but my mission is motivated out of the love of Jesus. It's not being against them. It's being, hey, I have something good for you. And I can say for sure here in North Hollywood, the more time that I spend with non-Christians, the more like I see sheep without a shepherd, and I don't long to tell them about Jesus because I'm against them, but because I have something for them, forgiveness, and I want to tell them about hope and truth and everlasting life. Like it's the love of Christ for them that motivates me to reach the lost. It's not that I'm going out against them. So I'd ask you to consider, hey, what motivates as you guys consider your relationships with people who don't know or follow Christ? Like what's your motivation to reach them? Is it because you have to in church, they told you that you're supposed to, or is it motivated out of the love of Christ? Jesus wants these people to know him, and so do I. Thirdly, and I kind of breezed over this when we were looking at the passage, but I think this is relevant to us. We must be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, is what Jesus says to the apostles. So wise as serpents, he says. That word wise means thoughtful or shrewd or prudent. So he's telling them on one hand, be careful. He says after that, beware of men. Watch what you say. Be discerning of who's receiving you and who's not receiving you. And I think we can do some of that in North Hollywood and around. Like, we don't have to enter into relationships and necessarily or unnecessarily stir up the wolves. Like, we have to be shrewd with our mission. We have to watch what we say. And yes, there's truth that we want to communicate, but we want to make sure that we communicate it in a way that people are rightly understanding what we're saying and aren't just seeing what we say out of context and as it looks like hatred or something like that. So I don't walk up to somebody usually and just say, hey, I'm Jared, you're going to hell. It's like, no, that wouldn't be very shrewd. And so, but if you take that to the extreme, like if you take being wise as serpents, or kind of this shrewdness or prudence to the extreme, you can see how that could become almost cunning or like deceitful. Mm-hmm. Like you're being so strategic in trying to get the gospel into people that you lose the point of the gospel, or you don't say anything at all, or people don't realize that you're actually communicating something different, or your life is about something different. So I think because of that, he says, then be innocent as doves. That word innocent means unmixed, or you have purity, or purity of your intention. So don't try to deceive people. We're not trying to like trick people into thinking, like our non-Christian friends, we're not trying to trick them into thinking, oh, we're not Christians either, and then all of a sudden, we got you, we're Christians and we want to know the gospel. Like, it's none of that. It's not like a bait and switch type thing. But we're up front. We're not trying to wear a mask. But you can see also how that kind of upfrontness, if you take that to the extreme, that can turn into just ignorance in sharing, or naivety in sharing the gospel. And so there's kind of a balance there. And I know when Mary Beth and I have sometimes, especially just people from out of town, Bakersfield and stuff, I don't want to rag on Bakersfield, dang it. I used to. Have people from out of town, Christians who aren't used to hanging out with non-Christians, unfortunately. And sometimes, like when they're over at our house with other non-Christians, they can say stupid things. Like they're definitely innocent, or maybe stupid as doves, right? And what they say may be true. Like, it's not that they're saying falsehoods, but for the non-believer to hear it and not have a context to receive that, and it's off base, it just communicates the wrong thing. So I'd say, like, just ask yourself in your relationships with non-believers. I'm not saying that's been any of you, but do you consider who you're with, and as you interact with people, are you shrewd and careful in your conversations and your actions with people, so that you don't unnecessarily drive people away or stir people up for not a good reason, but at the same time being upfront and honest, and it's not trying to hide that I'm a Christian or hide that I have a message for you about repentance. So it's kind of that balance that I think Jesus is calling his apostles to, and I think would equally call us to. Another thing, just a principle, just kind of about the mission of Jesus that we could draw out of this. This is a small thing, but I think helpful. I don't think this is Matthew's main point by any stretch, but I think it's wise when engaging in Jesus' mission to have at least another person with you. I mentioned earlier, like, these guys are sent out in twos, and later in the book of Acts, we also see teams of twos often go out. So it's Paul and Barnabas, and later Mark and Barnabas, and Paul and Silas. There's usually like these two guys together. And there's something to that even in Deuteronomy 19. It talks about, hey, if you're establishing a testimony against somebody, you need one witness isn't good enough. You need two witnesses. There's some like more validity in what you're saying if there's two people. Matthew 18 talks about two people. Ecclesiastes 4 talks about like how two are better than one, and help there. To be cliche, there's just strength in numbers, and I think it's smart to engage with other people when we're going out. So, for example, I'm going to go out to a bar to hopefully engage with people about who Jesus is and hang out. And maybe it would be best to bring another person with me. Like, that might be a really wise idea. I think that you can, again, I don't think that's what Matthew's not putting some command there, but it just would make sense. Fifthly, I think we can see that God will provide for the mission that he wants to accomplish. So he tells the apostles, don't take food or money with you on your mission. Now there's some historical specificity to that. Like, again, he's putting them on a particular mission, and he's telling them specifically, don't save up money, but the houses that you go to are going to provide for you. That I don't think we follow that exactly. But we can know that God, or it seems clear from here and other places, that God can and will adequately provide for the mission that he calls us to. And what I like about this is he's calling these people to an evangelistic mission to preach the gospel. And it doesn't take, we don't see anywhere really in the Bible, it doesn't take a huge church budget. Like, that's not necessary. Now it can be helpful, like churches use budgeted money to help to display and declare the gospel, and that's fine, but God's word going out doesn't take a big budget, but God will provide for whatever He wants to happen. Now this is very personal to Mary Beth and I, because we, in a very real and obvious and practical sense, are depending on God to provide for our financial needs for the mission that He's called us to. And God is providing through His church or other people who have welcomed us, in a sense. He's providing through you all and other people in churches to some other churches to literally meet the needs of the mission that we feel like He's called us to be a part of here in North Hollywood. And it hasn't always been easy to trust that God will provide for us, but we believe more and more that if God has Mary Beth and I in North Hollywood to display and declare the love and truth of Jesus here, if that's what He has us to do, then He will provide for that, however He chooses to do it. Right now it's being done through His church. And so I'd ask you, do you believe that God will provide for the mission that He has called you to accomplish? And you guys, just like Mary Beth and I, have mission field. And some of it's here in North Hollywood, and it's at work, and it's in leisure, and it's in the park, and it's in different places that you guys go. And I'm not talking about God's going to provide just for you to just relax and be comfortable, but God's going to whatever God wants for you to accomplish as far as His mission in your life of reaching the lost, He's going to provide that for you. And I think we can see that in the passage here. Not only will He provide financially, but I love how He says in verse 19, what you are to say, He tells the apostles, will be given to you in that hour. You don't even know everything that you're supposed to say, but God's going to bring to mind what you need to say in any given situation. For whatever He wants you to accomplish, God will provide for that. Sixth, and just lastly, we don't force the success of God's mission. So He talks to the apostles about shaking the dust off of their feet or off their sandals. And again, there's some historical specificness to that. But what He doesn't tell them is proclaim the gospel of the kingdom and argue with people until they believe it, or cram it down their throat just so that they will get it, or expect that until people have believed, then your work isn't done, and everyone needs to believe. But Jesus simply tells these apostles, if anyone doesn't receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that house or town. It's part of the plan. So I think a principle maybe that we can draw out of that is, if people are rejecting the news that we bring, it's not up to us to save them. Mary Beth and I went somewhere recently that we were expecting or hoping to have some conversations with people about Jesus and tell them the good news of Jesus and what He offers. But it was very clear to us that they weren't willing to talk to us about that. And we have other people in our lives that Jesus has brought to us that it's very clear are open to conversation, want to engage about those things and want to talk about Christ and want to know what we believe. So I'd say, kind of in light of this, I don't think it would make sense for us to pour our time into the people who are not interested in that conversation instead of the people that God is providing to us in our lives that seem open to talk about that too. So I'm not saying that you just ditch all the people who have ever rejected the gospel that you preach to them. I think there's something to longevity in their lives, but it certainly isn't. Our mission isn't failed. It's not up to us to save them, and we don't have to feel like the task isn't done until they come to know Christ, because many aren't going to come to know Christ. And at least here, Jesus is telling His apostles, hey, some aren't going to receive you, and you're going to move on. And that's okay. And and you think, well, gosh, that's shaking off of the dust off of your clothes or off of your feet. That doesn't sound very compassionate. Like, what isn't this motivated out of compassion? But if you remember, like Jesus says to these disciples, the harvest is plentiful. And so maybe there's others that God is responding and preparing that need to hear this. And so yes, my heart breaks that this person isn't receiving this news, but there's more to tell. Like there's others that maybe God would use you to speak to that would receive the news. So I don't know if you all have been like frustrated or just disappointed long-term in relationships with non-Christians that you're trying to share Christ with. And again, I'm not suggesting that you pull out of that relationship, but there are going to be those who don't believe. And that's not up to us to make that happen or not.
I have a quick question on just what you thought of the idea is, Jesus tells them to shake the dust off their feet because it's going to be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than those people that reject him. Why do you think he tells them that? Yeah. Is it so that they take it more seriously?
Yeah. Well, I don't remember if it's Mark or Luke, but Jesus, either at the same time or maybe another time, tells them in their going out to actually tell that to the city, about the judgment of Sodom, and it's going to be more bearable like that, like to actually verbalize that. And so I think a lot of it comes back to this. In this case, these are Jews who have knowledge of the Messiah and who he's supposed to be, who are not receiving this message. And so it seems even more, I don't know,
it seems like it would be a motivation to them to say, this is so
to
serious.
The hearers,
No, not only to them, but to the guys that are going out.
Okay, yeah.
To go and tell these people this message, because the ones that reject it, they're going to be judged really severely. And so it kind of puts it in their mind, this is hugely important.
Yeah.
But I need to study the one about saying and telling them it's going to be more bearable than something.
Yeah, it adds weight all the way around. I mean, to the declarers of the news and those that would hear it.
I think it's also significant to us that he sees that as a historical event. Mm-hmm. Some people like to separate Jesus from the rest of the Bible. These days, and he sees that as a historical event that happened to someone more.
Oh, right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
And
for sure.
It affirms it as real.
Yeah.
Same with Jonah and things like that.
Yeah. So, just to review those things, we have a mission that's motivated by Jesus' compassion. In that, we have to be wise as serpents, innocent as doves. I would say it's wise to not do that alone. God will provide for the mission, and we don't have to force the success of that mission. So in some ways, as difficult as it's going to be, as I run through those, I realize the pressure is off of me. It's going to be difficult, but it's God that's accomplishing something. And so our mission statement as a church is that we are a fellowship of Christians, or we're a partnership. We're in something together to some end, and that end is to declare and to display, like it's words and its actions, the love and truth of Jesus. And y'all, I want us to call each other to that. And there's going to be people along the way who don't believe that just are going to come in and they're going to want to check things out, and I want them to stick with us. But if you're a member of this church, if you're a Christian and you don't want to join us in the mission of telling and showing who Jesus is, then you're in the wrong place, because that's what we're going to call each other to and continue to call each other to. And I think we're going to see clearly as we study any part of the Bible, but certainly in the book of Matthew, that Christian living, it's not just about the living upright moral lives. That's a big part of it. Like, that's certainly what Jesus calls us to, but there's actually something to accomplish, like a work that he has called us to, that we need to be engaged with. So let's participate in that. Let me close in prayer, and then I had a question. What time is it, y'all?
8:59.
Okay. I might just pose a question. We won't have a lot of time to run through it, but let me pray. Father, again, thank you for your word. It's so, there's so many, it seems like, layers to studying it, and we need your help to know how to understand it rightly, how to apply it rightly. I pray that these few principles would be helpful to us. I pray that we would know where our place is in this plan of redemption that you've unfolded, and you're still unfolding as your message goes out to the world. Help us to know our part in that. Would you give us boldness to participate with you, but also the intelligence to not depend on ourselves for it, but to trust you to provide for where you lead us, and to trust you to be the one to change hearts and save people. Mm-hmm. And so we thank you that that's not our task to accomplish, but we ask that you'd help us just to be faithful in the works that you've prepared for us to walk in. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Lord. Amen.